Yeah, look, I'm as uncomfortable as everyone else. I kind of think, though, if we went out with the true figure for a zero budget loss and let the people come back to us, there's other councils, bigger, smaller, that's all I'm sitting on. And, you know, it still worries me. There's nothing in for earthquake strengthening in the future, but I could probably point to 4 council buildings that are going to need millions of dollars spent on them. So this isn't a panacea in any way. And look, my mother's 93 on a fixed income. She's going to choke when the rates go up. But we've got to be honest with the community. I guess the other thing, though, we do need to try and lift our contractors' levels of service, because you get the pothole argument and all those things that don't really buy in. But if we lift our level of service in certain areas, it'll help. And dare I say it, probably drop some of the consultants. You know, we're still paying $9,000 a year for someone in Aussie a week to help us with our finances. You know, it's just outrageous, some of the stuff we're spending. And I note that wasn't under your time, Nigel, as new CE, but they're still hanging around.
Okay, and that's my cue. Okay, so you've addressed this slide, thank you very much, where basically I was just going to ask the comfort level to allow us to go out with draft documentation. Again, it is not the finite end point. There's a lot of work and a lot of conversations to be had between now and then. So now what I'd like to do is we will start looking in depth at the group of activities and looking at basically some of the priorities and the funding impact statements and the levels of service for each one of these groups of activities. The council does need to consider the levels of service. Some of those levels are changing. Some are new levels of service or new KPIs to support the levels of service. And looking at the funding impact statements. And so the first one that we'll look at is governance, which is the democracy function for council. I think you guys know what it all includes, but the key issues are meeting the increasing legislative and regulatory changes, which can impact your decision-making. And some of the technological advancements, such as ChatGPT, which can impact information exchanges and the quality of that information. So we have to be very careful guardians of how we use that kind of technology to make sure we're not conveying the wrong thing. We'll go into the levels of service for governance. We basically have 2 levels of service, that we're going to have effective community engagement and that our council processes will comply with statutory requirements. For every level of service, which is what we're telling the community, this is what we're providing to you, we have to have some kind of measurement to tell us whether or not we're meeting those. So we've altered the performance measure for community engagement to actually talk about the quality of information as opposed to just the quantity of information. And that our resident satisfaction survey indicates they are happy with the quality of the information that they receive from us. So the target of that was 60%, because obviously you're not going to please everybody. We can change those targets if you wish. All we've done to change that is the amendment to the wording. The next 2 are talking about whether or not we adopt within the statutory timeframes. No changes to those levels of service at all, but we have added on a new one about the responses to LGOIMA requests to make sure that they are provided in accordance with statutory timeframes. So that's a brand new level of performance measure, about our statutory requirement in the governance function. Has anybody got any questions around any of those?
G'day. When you talk about satisfaction of the quality of information, not how it's delivered, 60% seems pretty low. I would have thought we'd be shooting for a much higher target than 60%. You know, shouldn't it be 80%? 8 out of our 10 ratepayers are happy with the quality of the information. Not the process of doing the road, but how we're informing them what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Completely over to you, councillors. We will change, yeah?
I think if we're currently meeting that target, then we should be increasing it for improving ongoing quality improvement. So do we know whether we're meeting that 60% now? And if so, we should be lifting it for quality improvement purposes.
I'm inviting Tony Morrison to the table, who actually worked with all of the activity managers on these specific levels of service and performance measures.
Kia ora koutou. Just in relation to that one, it's only measured every 2, or has been in the past, only measured every 2 years, which is why the suggested change to annual, so that you're getting annual information. It was last measured in 21-22 and 66%.
We should lift it.
We could actually stagger it, so the first year, we say we're trying for 70% and then move to 75, then move to 80. So we can definitely increase it incrementally over time.
I'd be supportive of that.
Councillor Piddington, you're happy with that?
Yep, that's fine.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, councillors. Now, we're going to move to the funding impact statement. Now, I want to highlight for this, because I'm going to front foot this. You will note in your governance and democracy funding impact statement that an incredibly high internal charge makes up the bulk of your OPEX. I need to explain, it's not just your salaries, okay? But internal costs to run governance include the majority of the chief executive's costs. It's 50% of each of the general management cost centers. They fit into governance, 50% to each of their units, so they split it between the two. Communications and engagement is also sitting underneath this for the OPEX cost. The Chamber's footprint alone here has a really high property and IT cost, which is included in the internal charges. It's pretty normal in all councils that your internal charges for governance are quite high, but really it's kind of like our purpose for being here. We're here to actually provide this. So it's more than just your salaries. I'm just trying to reflect as to why that is high in proportion to a lot of the other activities that you look at. Questions, sir?
Yeah, 50% of management into the corporate office seems high. Shouldn't it be a much higher on their business units where they're operating every day?
Oh, let me be clear. There's a difference between the management of the activity, which is really the general managers and some of that, and the actual activity itself. The activity itself is not attributed to this, only at the high management level.
So I took it that you're saying 50% of the group managers' charges against corporate service. And what I'm saying to you, I think
governance.
Against governance, I think that's awfully high. Yeah, I know the cost, but I mean, people will look at this and say, that's outrageous because of the number or whatever, but I just think it's high to put 50% of it against the corporate governance rather than the activity they're in. Could be a loan.
But we generate a massive amount of activity required just for the democracy of us to exist and to do our job, and they've got to do it by finding the information, and everything they do generates towards that, otherwise their existence wouldn't be there, and the cost is still there regardless.
significant increase, the 800,000 increase from 24 to 25, where every other year it's 100 and something plus. There's almost a
And the internal charges, I can't explain that. Andrea, do you know why internal charges have increased? Is that salary?
But a reality check.
824,000 is quite.
It's essentially what's happened in reality, yeah. So essentially it takes the budget and then in the background it looks at all of the deemed activities that need to recover. So if some of the areas are higher, all of that essentially is recovered by different areas. You'll find that some of the other charges in other areas even themselves up, but it comes down to what's actually spent and budgeted in different categories.
Okay. Moving on, we'll now move to community services. In the current LTP, this is called community support. Okay, it includes things like your airport, the climate change function of council, community development and funding, your community facilities, public amenities, emergency management, economic development, and of course, council housing. So there's a number of key issues impacting a wide range of activities, particularly around climate change. For the climate change activity, it's around council's management of its carbon emissions reduction and its plan on how it intends to achieve that. We're also talking about enabling growth in the district, either through the airport extension runway and refurbishment, and also supporting economic development through our agency with Venture Timaru. Ensuring all our public amenities and our facilities are compliant and they actually meet the community's needs. We're looking at an increased demand for emergency management with more severe weather events, of course, and increasing our reach with the community for the social well-being needs and providing them with adequate funding opportunities for community projects, which we do through our community grants and funding. So the priorities identified through these activities included assessing our facilities for earthquake strengthening, maintaining the council housing to meet the community's needs, and enhancing community resilience for natural disasters as we're getting more and more of those events. We'll now move to the...
Sorry, Vincie, I just have a question on those priorities. Like, I'm not comfortable that our priority includes assessing facilities for earthquake strengthening, but nowhere in our 10-year plan do we have really any costs to address what we may or may not find. And I know you can't include in there something that you don't know is going to happen, but I feel like that's a little bit of a mismatch.
Once you have your assessments and you know what you're in for, you can do LTP amendments through your annual plan and put in the real charges. But at the moment, it's an unknown quantity.
We just need to be honest with our community, what we have in our LTP, but just as importantly, what we don't have in there. Yeah.
Very good point, that we can actually help explain that.
And another question that I've talked about a lot is, you know, I kind of felt like when you're doing a long-term plan, it's the time to ask those big questions. And I always question, and I don't have a view on it, I'm not suggesting anything here, but is council the best vehicle to be delivering social housing for our community? And when do we actually have that conversation? Because I feel like it's not going to be in this LTP anymore.
I think there's 2 points on that housing. One is we're about to do a 17A, which will answer that. But also, I'm not sure about the wording maintaining council housing to meet the community's needs. The community needs will grow, and we don't have growth in this area in our LTP, so we might have to go maintaining council housing, maintaining the current community housing or something, unless we really do think we're going to grow in that area, which this LTP is suggesting we're not. Yeah.
Sorry, I was too busy analysing the previous page to hear what you said. What does this all involve again? The community service, like you rattled off a round of things. Oh, it's up there. Oh, God. Right.
Just in that second paragraph, it needs to be broken down, because key issues, climate change, et cetera, cool. The next point should be enabling growth with the airport and supporting economic development. There should be key points, because I'm not sure about ensuring public amenities like toilets, fishing huts and motor camps, because some of the fishing huts will be a retreat strategy. We may not have the same number of motor camps. If toilets get expensive to replace, we may close them. And toilets in general, are they in the right place? So here we're enhancing everything, whereas, I don't know, the future of these things will be looked at. Because if I read this and I'm in a fishing hut, I can roll up here and say, I want my enhancements. You've said that.
We haven't used the term enhancements, we just said that they would be compliant.
But even that's dangerous, because of the cost of compliance for some of those things is a massive cost that's not in our budget.
Is it just a consideration versus an issue?
Yeah.
To be clear, in the LTP, this is not how these are presented. This is just for the intent of a brief high-level overview for this presentation. So we flesh these out a wee bit better in the LTP document itself.
Well, that's cool, but note what I've just said, because I don't
Yep.
want them appearing as though we're going to do all these wonderful things with no budget.
Yeah. There's a difference between the issues and the priorities. The priorities are really about the action points. Like, we can acknowledge that having compliant facilities is an issue without actually having it as a priority, because we don't have the budget. That's the reality.
I think there's just wording, it's,
Yeah, absolutely.
To inform a future budget or just how you
Yeah.
add to it, to understand that there is some costs
Yeah.
associated in the future.
Okay. Right, so moving to the levels of service for this. And I think you will actually find that there's 2 pages well, there will be 2 pages of this, so we'll just actually go, of course, the levels of service pertain to specific activities within this group of activities. So the first one is talking about the facilities, the airport, and council housing units are well-maintained, clean, and safe. That is an existing level of service. But we have some new performance measures in there around complying with the building regulations and healthy home standards, as is required under legislation, and the facilities meet the safety requirements under legislation. So those are 2 new performance measures that are being introduced in this LTP. And the civil aviation accreditation remains as is, because that's always been one of our KPIs.
For the council one, should it not say if occupied? Because my understanding is we have a number of units that aren't healthy homes compliant and aren't occupied. So the point of difference is we may not get round to upgrading some. So the word if occupied needs to be in there. So I'd expect if we had a tenant, it would be compliant. If we don't, for some reason, it doesn't need to be.
That's a good suggestion.
I also question where the environmental requirements fit. Like, we only talk about meet legislative safety requirements, what about environmental?
Some of those will be covered in the healthy home standards, but can you be specific about?
I'm more talking about community facilities around toilets, because there are some issues in the area with old septic tanks that will need to be replaced, and there are environmental compliance, that's safety as well, but more environmental.
Okay, so we'll add safety and environmental requirements. So community facilities
So,
meet
yeah, I
legislative
agree.
safety and environmental?
Sorry, I was just trying to process in my mind that we're not setting ourselves up to fail, and that, yes, they will meet them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll be there.
Yeah, yeah.
Just a question, this might be for Mr Cooper, in regard to how well prepared for a disaster residents feel, and that's at 50% or more feeling prepared. Have you got any comment on whether that's a good number or not? It's hard to get people in that zone, but should we be doing more around the education if only 50% are prepared? Yeah, yeah. No. Yeah, well, that's a good point. Yeah, show of hands if you feel prepared now.
I think it's the first time it's been put in, isn't it? So it'd be interesting to see what the number comes back at. But as a target, we should be stretching ourselves. But also, we need to resource that if we are going to try and stretch ourselves. So, but we don't really know what that balance is yet. So we could suck it and see, yeah, and then we could stretch it out in future years if we because ideally it'd be great if it was 70 or 80%, wouldn't it?
I can promise you, after working years with the Red Cross and earthquake recovery at the council, we would be really happy if 50% were prepared when events happened.
I mean, 50% is probably realistic, but it's how you get over that. But I mean, I don't think we should be accepting of that as a community in leadership roles, yeah.
Probably is a good first-year baseline measure, and then, as Mr. Cooper just stated, progressively look for improvements in that. Okay. Right, we have not proposed any changes whatsoever in the contribution to council's role in economic development and tourism. That remains as is. Now we get to the meaty ones around our climate change. So these are all new. Okay, and if you look onto the screen, the first level of service is talking about the identification and reduction of the council's corporate carbon emissions. Please keep in mind this is one of the key focuses for Audit New Zealand for this LTP. We have proposed a couple of baseline measures using benchmarks from other councils and other organizations as to what would be suitable. So the first thing that we were talking about is just establishing our baseline emissions from council activities. It's great that we can do a whole of council one, but in order to reach any reduction targets, each unit needs to kind of have some understanding of how it's contributing and look for where it can reduce its own to contribute to the collective whole of the reduction plan. So we're looking at, in year one, just being able to establish some baseline for 10 activities, in year two for another 10 activities, and then in year three for the remaining activities. So by the end of the first 3 years, we should have some really good baseline data for all activities within council. The next one was to develop the climate action plan to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, as is the target. And we're looking at that being developed, adopted, and implemented. And I do understand that there has been a climate change policy recently adopted. So it would be looking at the action plan to put some of those principles in place. So we have suggested a staged approach, looking at the 4% reduction in carbon emissions achieved, and looking to increase that to 5 or 6% in carbon emission reductions in later years. That is a new performance measure. Any questions around those two at this point in time? Michelle?
It concerns me that the climate action plan is only to achieve net zero carbon. Where is our plan, and I don't believe it's in the next step, where is our plan to help those communities that are seriously affected by coastal erosion? And, and all of those other things that will go into that climate action plan. Down below, you've got council infrastructure.
Right.
But where is our plan that we talked about for the community, which is much more than just emissions reduction? It's about how do we adapt and be resilient for climate change and reduce our emissions.
Okay. These specific KPIs, we're talking about the council's corporate responsibility and obligations that audit would be looking for. You're talking about the community resilience and how council's role in helping them achieve them as well. We can develop some KPIs and a new level of service around that.
Even if the wording in this is changed to a climate action plan that includes how to get to net zero. It just worries me when you look at this, that's all that plan is about, and it's not, in my mind,
Right.
all that plan is about.
Yeah.
I'm okay with not having targets in that for the rest of the plan, but this, when you read it, says to me that's all we're interested in.
Right. For our own performance measures, I think we focused on council's actions. So you're saying you don't want a performance measure about the community's achievements, but you do want it noted that the action plan is a wider document than just council-focused. Good. Okay. Easily clarified, thank you.
I just have a question around, so year one is develop an action plan, but year two will be, I read that as fully implemented. So surely it will be a staged action plan. So how do we, again, I'm a bit worried that we will have an action plan that won't be able to be fully implemented. So how do we, it seems too rigor. It seems too,
So you want a softer
it's new, so.
rollout?
I think so, it definitely will. We won't go.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we've seen what our policy, we've had plenty of presentations on what we need to achieve in the future. I just feel like, again, that it's new, so it will need.
So I think the wording needs to be around the other way. 4% reduction in carbon emissions achieved in line with the approved climate action plan. Because that's only 4%. I'm assuming the action plan will be aiming at a bigger target than that. If we just turn around, the focus for that measure is the 4% reduction, really.
Can I ask about the 4%? Where did that figure come from? You don't know.
It was just benchmarked against what other councils had in some of
Oh,
their.
So we've seen it somewhere else. We haven't just picked an arbitrary number.
No,
Good.
we use benchmarking from other organizations and councils.
Are the targets in line with the Zero Carbon Act, do you think?
Which is why we've actually increased them in later years, so that, because if you just stayed at 2, 3, 4%, you're never going to reach your zero carbon. It's ambitious. It is ambitious. Okay. So the next level of service, we're looking at council's infrastructure assets are managed to mitigate damage from climate change impacts, and that's about enhancing the resiliency of our infrastructure networks. Again, another focus for audit in this LTP. So we're actually talking about the assets have the climate change management plan for our assets to protect the critical infrastructure from damage due to the climate change. And we're looking, the KPI is really about having a plan actually developed and adopted and implemented over time. So the first thing we have to do is get all that baseline information. So again, this is a staged approach over the course of a few years. So the first thing is that we actually have the vertical and horizontal infrastructure database that shows the likely impact of climate change. And a lot of this information is actually already held by a lot of the asset managers. We just don't have one overarching document to actually show it all, to keep track. We look at the mitigation plans to protect those critical infrastructure assets from those impacts, and we add that into the database. And then we actually look at the rolling out of the mitigation plans over time and make keep a record of progress made, recording the damage done to some of those assets due to the climate change impacts, and see if we have made any significant improvements or helped the resiliency of our network infrastructure. Keeping in mind that places like roading and water and some of the park facilities, they are very proactive in trying to mitigate climate change impacts. We're just talking about being able to show the evidence of that in a really clear process and documentation.
What's the difference between that and the climate action plan? Are one the same?
No, because one's talking about protecting the infrastructure and the other one's talking about reducing your carbon emissions.
I think they're both important. I think we need to have a plan for our own assets. I see the climate action plan, what we've talked about to the state, as a wider community thing that's more than just council assets.
Yeah.
And also emissions reductions.
Sorry, to go back to that one too, I just wonder in year 2 it says, council approved climate action plan implemented as appropriate. Because as appropriate, because we don't know what it is, so it just helps us with future, how we would stage that. So as appropriate.
If there's a level of discomfort with that 4%, we could move to a sort of continuous improvement in order to reach the goal in 2020, or whenever the date is, carbon zero.
2050.
And 2050, so that gives us flexibility, this LTP, to, as long as we're continuously improving, we're heading in the right direction, whether it's a step change or a small change, depending on what's happening in that LTP period.
How would you measure that to report it?
Through the carbon emissions footprint work that we do through Toitu.
That makes sense to me, and also makes your reporting a lot easier, because what do you do if you don't hit 4%?
Or 8%, yeah.
Okay.
There was a few things with that, so just to clarify, so we're talking about,
Widening the climate action plan?
yeah, and, yeah, sort of that step change where appropriate. Yeah, so
Yep.
just getting that wording right.
Thank you, councillors. Those are good points and easily incorporated. Okay. Now we're looking at the funding impact statement for community services so that you can actually see, it's the third page of your big A3 documentation. So you can see the OPEX and capital funding there. Any questions about any of the figures that you see there?
Just someone remind me, in year 2028, under the capital funding, it goes up from 1 million to 3, then 4, 3, and drops back a bit.
You'll see that in the first 3 years, part of the looking at trying to make cost savings. There was a lot taken out in those years, but it's going to come back in 2028 to then essentially carry on those upgrades of facilities.
Kind of what worries me, though. We save. So we go from 1 million to 4.7 million in 2029. So what are we saving on and then putting back in? Do we know?
Not off the top of my head, but essentially if we look at the capital program, it'll have it.
Some of it will be things like your public toilets that you've said not to do in the first few years, and some of those will be getting pretty old by that stage, and will need fixing.
And deferring of some projects as well. Deferring of some projects around the libraries and things like that.
Okay.
It's a good news, in 3 years someone else will get a shot at that number.
Okay. So now we're moving on to district planning and environmental services. This is an area that you're very familiar with, of course, building control, district planning, environmental compliance, which includes the environmental health, animal control, and parking enforcement. So the changes around the Resource Management Act, it's a movable feast. Things are coming in and things are going out. And it's a very dynamic environment and hard to keep track of at this current point in time. We do know that there's issues that are going to create resourcing impacts for us with the changing legislation around the RMA and also the Building Act. There's increased demand for the consent processing, the suitability and capacity of the existing dog pound for increasing numbers of detained dogs. That's been discussed previously. So those are some of the key issues around there, also affecting land use changes, et cetera. But the priority that they have at the moment, and this is a struggle for particularly one of the units in district planning, is keeping pace with the changing legislation and being able to reflect that accurately on our public website. Ensuring enough resource is available to meet those key performance indicators and meet customer expectations, particularly around consenting, et cetera. And looking at investigating the new dog pound, which has been deferred out of the current LTP timeline, but will need to be addressed in the next LTP for after year 11 or year 10.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. I'm uncomfortable that we say 80% of the statutory timeframe.
Oh, sorry, you've moved to the...
Sorry, I've got one too many, sorry. I'll go back anyway. Key issues, resourcing impact of Resource Management Act. If we're getting, shouldn't we be charging what it costs to do? So I'm not sure why there would be an impact. And if the dog pound is past year 11, it shouldn't even be mentioned here because we look silly talking about something we haven't budgeted for. Yeah, so we're saying here it's a priority. It's such a priority, we've taken it out. So we can't have it both ways. I wouldn't have thought. But it does concern me, the resourcing impact, Paul, if you can talk about it, because user pays. There shouldn't be too much of a in building, etc. And my third one is, I'd like to see the world enabling somewhere around the things we're doing in district planning and environmental services. I don't know quite how we build that in, but that's the biggest complaint I get. You guys stick to the legislation, but you don't enable anything. And I know it's a fine line, but I'd like to see that in there.
I think our philosophy in district planning and building is how can we help? So if people come to us and what they're proposing doesn't fit legislation or what the shape of the hole that it has to be put through, it's how can we help to get what you need as close to what you've asked for, but still meet the legislative requirements. That's how we operate at the moment. I think we are enabling, and that's what we try to be. The fact that we are regulators and we have to have those difficult conversations with those customers and say, let's reshape that and see what we can do, makes us the bad guys often in the perceived mind of the community, I suppose, because we're saying, actually, you can't do that, you have to do it another way. So we can put enabling, but we don't want to be misleading either. We are the regulator. Yeah, so it's a balance. So I'd be happy to look at it with the team though and see if we can build that in.
In terms of cost, why are we going to have a financial problem?
What we've done traditionally in district planning in particular is we haven't passed on the cost of the full cost of the consultant when those resource consent applications have been processed outside of TDC. So if there's an overflow mechanism to consultants to pick up, or it's of a technical nature, we'll poke it out to a consultant to do that work. It comes back in, we scrutinise it and put the decision out. What we charge is what it would have cost had that person come to us and that we had the resource in-house to deal with it. We charge at that rate, at officer level, not at consultant level. We could change that through this LTP and just charge at cost. So, but then it becomes an equity issue between who's processed internally and who's, when we're busy, pushed out to a consultant.
I'd like to know then, Paul, what the shortfall is this year. It's probably millions of dollars, is it? Because, you know, that's one of the complaints I have. You know, you're using a consultant that costs 3 times what it is to employ someone. Now, if we know each year we're going to be 2 planners short and they're going out to a consultant, build that into the cost and average it. Because otherwise, my mum's paying for it at 93 because we didn't get the numbers right.
Absolutely she is. And we can't know the numbers before the year. The numbers are what they are when they come in. Like we're in a bit of a lull now, but it's starting to build again. But we've been through a bit of a lull. We've been the lowest for some time. But now the numbers are starting to come up again. So you're just... We're at the whim of the market, really, in that regard. What we could do is look at, like last year when we went through the annual plan process and we looked at the fees and charges for planning, for example, we looked at what the internal cost of a planner to look at it was and what a consultant planner charges, and we brought it closer to the median so that there's less being paid for by the ratepayer funding that public good component of district planning, and the balance is more user pays. So we did that last time round, but we can get rid of that altogether if that's what council chooses to do. But that's a decision for council. Yeah.
The dog issue, is it a priority or not? Because it's not in our capital, so I'm presuming it's not. So why would we even mention it?
Well, if you talk to the animal control team, yes, it's a priority. But for the organisation, it was a priority that we were willing to push out through this process because something had to give. And you're quite right, it's how can it be a priority in this next 10 years if we're putting it outside this 10 years? So I kind of agree with that logic, yeah. But it's there because it is a priority. We're not fully compliant with the rules in terms of exercise areas for dogs, which is by no means unusual looking at pounds around the country. And the facilities are located next to quite a smelly operation that actually impacts on staff quite significantly, as in it permeates through their hair and clothing and it just stinks. So there's a number of things there that need to be addressed, plus it's too small for the job we're actually asking of it these days. Yeah.
I just want to note that there is a difference between raising it as an issue and then making it as a priority, because one of the problems that we've actually got in what you're facing with your infrastructure issue particularly is that there were a lot of issues around water that there was no preconceived kind of indication in previous LTPs. And until this LTP, when now we actually have to pay for them, it does come as a big surprise. So we can acknowledge that we have some issues and that we're looking to investigate how to address them without putting the money in it, because we just don't have the financial means to actually achieve it.
So I think the pound is an issue. And it's mainly an issue, the biggest issue is where it's located with staff. So I've visited the pound. I came away stinking, covered in black stuff from the next door neighbour. Now, that's the main, in my mind, that's the biggest issue. So if that comes to a head, then we may have to do a, what do you call it, a variation, an amendment when it comes to a head.
But this is my problem. We talked about we wouldn't cut things we need to do. Look, I don't have an issue in or out, but I don't want to be consulting if it's in year 11. If we need to bring it in, we need to bring it in, but we need to put it in the budget, because otherwise that'll be a $3 million blowout budget in year 2 or 3.
It won't cost you $3 million for a pound.
Well, by the time you buy the land of a decent size, it may cost you quite a bit, I would have thought.
Plenty of land.
Got a nice corner site in Washdyke. The interesting thing with the pound, though, it does have all that activity, it does have a revenue stream, doesn't it? So it is slowly accumulating funds, which effectively it can pay for itself. Yeah.
My point is it won't be free, will it? So if it is...
Why it got pulled out was because we were trying hard to pull back on things. That's the reason we pulled it out.
Yeah, I get that, but you're now saying it's a priority, so I'm saying if it is...
I think it's an issue.
Well, an issue, health and safety, what you're talking about, will become a priority. Therefore, I want to know what the number is and I want it back in.
Okay.
Because again, we're going out consulting on something that we know that's an issue.
Yep.
We're going to do something about, but we're ignoring in our capital budget.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and I think it's how we highlight, because this goes alongside the likes of earthquake strengthening. We're doing a bit of work to understand exactly what the numbers are in the next 3 years, and then there is going to be an impact on the numbers after that, and it's just how you tell that story correctly. I'm not hell-bent on necessarily there being a number yet, because I know I've talked with Mr. Traynor, and he's of the view that we can, do that cheaper than what we thought we could. So, maybe we don't. This is the problem also. If, we do high-level numbers, and often they're incorrect, and that's a challenge as well. So, how do we get a more accurate number as we take the time to get it?
I need to be really clear that this is not what we consider a consultation document issue. So it will, our intent was within the activity statements, we would actually say, yes, these are some of the issues that are being faced underneath this group of activities, without specifying that it itself is an issue for consultation for investment, but just signaling to the community that it is something that needs to be addressed in the future.
Confusion is in your priorities, you've got investigate a new dog pound. Well, it's not going to take 11 years to do that. If it does, we're in trouble. So, because originally we had $2.5 million in the budget for a new dog, whatever it is. Yep. New pound, sorry. Yep. So that's things.
So we can just take it out in the priorities altogether about the investigation, if you want? We can.
No, we're going to do it differently. We've asked to put it back in, so we'll be putting about $500,000 in year 2 or 3, and that'll sit there. It'll change the numbers a bit, but that's what we'll do.
Okay, councillors, so based on that, what we'll do is we'll probably put it in year 3 because of the way that the CapEx budget is spaced for the first 2 years, pretty front-loaded. So we'll put it in for year 3 at $500,000? Thank you very much. We'll do that. Okay. I'm very conscious. Oh, we're just at the point where it's supposed to be your lunchtime, so quick question. Do you want to go through the levels of service and the FIS statement and finish with environmental services and then break for lunch, or break for lunch now and then we can come back to the levels of service? Which would you prefer? Break now. You've had a big morning. Thank you very much, councillors, for all your help and support and giving us some very clear direction. Thank you.